WBNE.
Hello, and welcome to episode 185, all about the Lord of the Rings appendices, Appendix B, being the 185th part of That's What I'm Talking About. Hello, my name is Mary Clay. If that's too complicated for you, just call me MC. I've been experiencing the world of J.R.R. Tolkien for the first time, and this week we are continuing our dive into the Lord of the Rings appendices with Appendix B. Today, I am joined by Bekah of Tolkien Tidbits. Welcome.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, excited to have you on. I reached out to you I almost want to say pre-Rings of Power even,
yes,
but both of us had different schedules, so I'm glad that I finally got to have you on.
Yeah, me too. I'm glad it finally worked out.
Why don't you tell me and the listeners a little bit about your history with Tolkien? Like, how did you get introduced to it? And then what is it that you are doing now with Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and whatnot?
Yeah, so I was first introduced to Lord of the Rings by the Peter Jackson movies. My mom had read and loved the books when she was in college, and so she insisted we all go see it when Fellowship of the Ring came out. And at the time, we were at my cousin's for the holidays, so we all piled into our vans and went to the theater, and I have to say, I really did not like it.
That's okay. That's fair. Yeah. I actually watched, for a college film class, I actually had to watch Fellowship of the Ring. And this was well before I even thought about doing a Tolkien podcast or anything. And that was my first watch and only watch until the podcast, and I also did not like it. So
yeah. I don't know if for me, I don't know if it was that it was just too scary or if I was slightly traumatized by Gandalf's fall, but I spent most of the movie hiding under my coat and I came away really not into it. So the next year when the Two Towers came out, I was adamant that I would not see this movie. But we were again at my cousin's for Christmas and everyone was going. So I feel like I was basically forced to go kind of against my will and very unhappy about it. But I think I must have matured a lot over that year or something, because this time I fell in love with it. And
well, that's good. Yeah.
Yay. Went back and rewatched The Fellowship of the Ring straight after, thought it was the best thing ever, read the books, and the obsession just began. And so the next year when Return of the King came out, I had my birthday party to go see the movie. And I heard on your podcast a couple episodes ago with the Lorehounds, I think it was John, also went to Return of the King birthday party, and I can confirm it was the best party ever.
I love that. That's so fun. I think my only comparison is I think I went to a birthday party where we went and saw Harry Potter.
Oh, nice.
I want to say it was it might have been Sorcerer's Stone.
Oh, wow.
Someone's, yeah. So if you were, a child of the early 2000s and you had a birthday anywhere from I would say October to January, that was always when the Harry Potter and the Lord of the Rings movies were coming out. You could, really good birthday party ideas.
Absolutely.
There.
Yes. Yeah. And so, ever since then, Lord of the Rings has been a part of my life. I've taken classes. I rewatch the movies multiple times a year. But I feel like I really got back into it a lot more in depth, maybe 2.5 years ago when I moved back to the US after living and studying in London for 7 years, and my mom and I decided to reread the books together. But then she was actually diagnosed with breast cancer, and so we began listening to the audiobook of The Fellowship of the Ring on walks when we could, and as we were waiting for her appointments and through her chemo and all of her treatments and everything. And it was this really encouraging and bright spot in the midst of a really challenging and difficult time. So we were really enjoying that. And then as we were going along, we were also listening to the Prancing Pony podcast, chapter by chapter. And Alan and Sean at the time were constantly referencing the Silmarillion. And so we figured after we finished the Fellowship that we really ought to go back to the very beginning and try and tackle the Silmarillion. So that's how we began the Silmarillion. And as I was doing all of that, I just got really excited about it and all the new things I was learning and discovering. And so I decided to start an Instagram account and then a blog to sort of share all the little tidbits that I'm constantly picking up through my Tolkien explorations. And yeah, just trying to like add a little bit of, fun and lightness and little pieces of this world that I'm just exploring. And then hopefully helping others to make Tolkien a little bit more digestible.
That's awesome. That's really wonderful that you and your mother were able to use Tolkien and Lord of the Rings as something to connect over and be distracted by. And I've heard like a lot of really wonderful stories of how Tolkien in this story has like the power to bring people together or connection or provide a light spot in a very dark time. So I'm really sorry that that all of that was happening to you guys. And I hope, is your mother doing well now?
She's doing better. Yeah. I mean, there's been ups and downs. She's finished with the majority of her treatment. She still has like daily pills she has to take. So yeah, there's definitely ups and downs, but she's doing a lot better than she was. And it was amazing. And I was just thinking about it earlier because today's actually the day we're recording is actually World Cancer Day. And so I don't know, I was just thinking about it and how it was like really cool that in the midst of this really hard time, we could sort of bond over something that we both loved. And she hadn't read the books since she was in college. So it'd been a really long time for her. And I hadn't read them for some time as well. And so, yeah, it was really cool.
That's really awesome. Well, best of luck to your mother as she continues on her health journey. And
thank you.
We'll all be sending her positive energy and vibes as she continues.
Thanks.
Yeah, just really wonderful stuff to hear about what Tolkien can do for people.
Absolutely.
Even so many years after the publication of the book. So, all right, let's dive in now to Appendix B, which is the Tale of Years, Chronology of the Westlands. So I guess a full disclaimer that this is kind of the first time I'm covering something that I actually previously had read, but not in full, because when I finished Return of the King, a lot of people said, "Oh, are you going to do the appendices?" Or like, "Oh my gosh, even when you finish the last chapter, you have to keep reading and read the appendices, or at least read Appendix B." And people pointed me specifically to, I think it's called the Chief Days. People specifically pointed me to that because that is where it starts telling you like what happened to our characters after Lord of the Rings ended, after Frodo has sailed off, Sam has the red book, he returns home, but then like what happens to their lives after that? That's always something that like as a reader or even a viewer of a movie, a TV show, you're always thinking about like, well, what happens to these characters when we're not, the story is done being told to us. So I did read that section. So there are a lot of details that I did already know and weren't surprises to me. But I did read the rest of it now. I have to say, if anyone is having trouble with the Silmarillion, Rings of Power, this is a really helpful appendix because it's all laid out very clearly, organized in a giant timeline and showing like by year what is happening. So if anyone, if you're listening and you have confusion about like, oh my gosh, when did that event happen? When did this is a great resource to turn to help clear up that confusion.
Yeah, I think it's a really helpful reference. Like when people are reading the books and as you say, like for the Rings of Power sort of timeline, it's really helpful just to sort of get an idea of like where people are at different times.
Yes, yeah, totally. And it's also when the timeline gets to the years that like Lord of the Rings is taking place, and it's like, oh, okay, we already know all of this was happening, but it'll also say like at this time this character was also doing this thing. So it really puts it into perspective of like, oh my gosh, when when Gandalf was like, when the Fellowship was leaving Lorien, that's when Gandalf was like still fighting the Balrog or whatever it was, It really puts it into perspective. So we aren't going to focus too heavily on the first part of this appendix just because it covers stuff that we literally just talked about on the podcast. I don't want to bore you guys by talking more about it. But I will point out, a couple things here and there of like, oh, I've had a question about this before, I was confused, or oh, I didn't realize that. Yeah. So first, just some, I don't know, trivia for you. If anyone is ever at like a trivia night and there's a question about like, when did the second age in Middle Earth begin? So the first age ends with Melkor's defeat. And that is the Silmarillion, is basically all of the first age leading up to that giant battle where the Valar finally come in and help to defeat Melkor. So that is the end of the first age. Then the second age then begins with like reconstructing life after that. Numenor's beginning to be established, that stuff. And then the second age ends with I'll say the first defeat of Sauron. I think like he technically has a couple defeats, like a couple things where like there's a battle and like he's forced to flee from place to place, but this is really the first time he's really knocked down a peg. And it's that battle with I think it's called the Battle of the First Alliance, maybe even, where all of the elves come in, Isildur is there, Elendil is there, and so the second age ends when Sauron is defeated and Isildur takes possession of the One Ring. And then the third age ends with the destruction of the One Ring, with the events of Lord of the Rings. So that's kind of all laid out. If you've ever been confused about what's the first age, what's the second age, when is all that happening, I'd say it's also helpful to remember if you are like forgetting or you get confused. It's like they each end with a giant war.
Yeah.
They all end in giant battles.
Yeah, I thought that was quite interesting, right? That each age isn't like a certain amount of time. It's just marked by like the defeat of this great evil, like the overthrowing of Sauron, or, like the destruction of the One Ring. So it's very like a very clear marker of when each age ends.
Yes. So the second age is when, like I said, Numenor is beginning to grow and prosper, and this is when the Rings of Power are created. There's this little paragraph, like section right before it gets into the second age timeline, and just one thing I want to point out: it mentions that when the elves in Middle Earth near Eregion learned that the dwarves had discovered Mithril, they moved closer to the Misty Mountains. And it's so funny because had I not read the Silmarillion and like had I maybe just stopped with like Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, I thought the elves were like really cool, all this stuff. But the more I learned about the elves, the more I was like, I do not get good vibes from you. This just has colonizer vibes to me of like, oh, this like race of people that we have historically, beaten down or, been, fought with in some battles. They found a cool new resource. Okay.
We want to get in on that.
Exactly. So they move closer to the Misty Mountains, and like, I guess we can say thankfully it doesn't turn into anything violent or harsh like I think it would if it was real life.
Yeah.
But
it's actually kind of the opposite, yeah?
Yes, yeah. It says the friendship that grew between the people of Durin and the elven smiths of Eregion was the closest that there had ever been between the two races. So still think it's it's nice, but I still think it's really shady of those elves to be like, oh, you found Mithril? Interesting. Fair. Let's get in on that action.
Yeah. A lot of this is sort of in the Rings of Power series. And I know when I was watching Rings of Power, I was a little bit like, I love the friendship between Durin and Elrond. It's beautiful.
My gosh, yes.
I mean, everyone loves it. But I was a little concerned that, like, because I felt very strongly that, you know, the friendship, as you did at the end of your last episode, you talk about Legolas and Gimli and how theirs is the closest friendship between elves and dwarves ever. So I was like, I love this friendship, but I don't feel like it should be more than what Legolas and Gimli share. But then, like, rereading this and realizing, but actually, like, what Rings of Power is doing, like, there is this really close friendship between dwarves and elves. It's the closest that they ever have, and, like, what they're doing and working together is exactly what the show is, like, building up. So I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. A lot of this is, like, oh, okay, I see where, or I see how the writers of Rings of Power, like, got that information
where they're drawing it from.
Exactly, yeah. So even though, you know, a lot of the people who are really into and really know their Tolkien lore are like, it's not accurate to blah, blah. I still say it's very, like, it definitely has its roots in there. They're not just pulling this stuff out of nowhere. And I think that it's so interesting. I think it's interesting that you say that you're worried. You don't want the show to have, I'm getting all the elves and whatnot. God, what's his name? Elrond.
Yes.
How you still want Legolas and Gimli to be like the height of like elf-dwarf friendship.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting because I think like, yes, we all love the Elrond-Durin friendship, but I think the way that they can make sure that we still have like Legolas and Gimli, you know, up on a pedestal, I feel like it's very possible that they lead to a really big falling out because
I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, like stuff that happens either with Mithril or the Rings of Power, or I think there's a lot more opportunity for them to have to choose. And that the other thing is that Legolas and Gimli are not like, yes, they are important in like, they are important to elves and they are important to dwarves, but they're not like the main leaders. So they can kind of, you know, do whatever they want. They can kind of say that's like, true. You know, I'm not worried about the expectations of what my people have of me. Whereas Elrond and Durin are very much in positions where like Durin one day, Prince Durin is going to be king and he's going to have to choose probably between, you know, defending his people or, you know, his friendship with elves.
Yeah.
So I think that could very, you know, there's a lot of room for them to go. And I think that's good.
Yes.
Well, a lot of exciting opportunities.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you're right. Like, I think the show, obviously there's a number of seasons left and there's a lot of time for them to sort of develop this relationship between dwarves and elves. And then, you know, to get from that point to where we see the relationship between dwarves and elves in The Lord of the Rings, obviously there's a huge difference. So it'll be really interesting to see how the show sort of gets from that point to Lord of the Rings and what will happen between the races and all of that.
Yes, yeah. More on Rings of Power, both the show and the literal Rings of Power. I know I've always had some confusion, and I think it is kind of confusing too, about what did Tolkien write about the creation of the Rings of Power, and then the show is also kind of doing something a little bit different.
Yeah.
So it's okay. Anyway, I'll just read what the timeline says. Yeah. In the year 1200 of the Second Age, this is when Sauron is like, oh, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to befriend the elves, and whatever comes of that will come of that. And Gil-galad sees right through him. It says refuses to treat with him. But the smiths of Eregion are won over. So that is kind of depicted in the show, even though, you know, Sauron and, spoiler alert, Halbrand, you know, even though Halbrand is different from this version of Sauron hiding among, you know, befriending the elves, we do still see that play out where, like, he wins them over.
It's,
and
like, very condensed, right? It's like you see it in a very much shorter span of time where he's, like, working with Celebrimbor and they're making the rings and... Yeah. Then
in the year 1590, so what is it, 300, almost 400 years later, the three rings are created in Eregion. And then 10 years after that, Sauron creates the one ring. So that at least clears that point up for me. I've always been a little bit confused. I'm like, so wait, are the 3 rings, the 9 and the 7, are they all created and then Sauron makes the 1 ring, or what happens? So at least that clears that up, that the elves make their rings and then Sauron makes the 1 ring. It unfortunately, the timeline doesn't say anything else about when the
and men's rings.
Exactly. I'm like, so when did those come into play? And like, when did he give the rings to, like, when did he make the rings and when did he give them to the dwarves? And I know, and from our previous chapter, at least with the dwarves, we know that like the dwarves were unable to be manipulated by the rings. So like I would have appreciated that within the timeline to be like, in this year, Sauron realizes that the dwarves are not going to be controlled by the rings. Yeah. And starts using other means to get the rings or something. Or you're like, in this year, Sauron takes this ring. Right. That I think that would have been helpful to have more of the information about the other rings in here.
I agree, yeah. Because there's a lot of time, right? It's like from 1500 when they start to 1590. That's 90 years that they're using to create the rings, whereas in the show, again, condensed timeline, it's like 2 weeks and they make
2
the
days,
3. Yeah. But it's like the show has a lot of room, right, to sort of play around and, explore that because it's not really specified.
Yes, yeah. And it's funny because like technically, like it is a condensed timeline in the show because when the 3 rings are created, like for example, Elendil, I don't think Elendil is not alive at this point. But in the show, he is alive when the 3 rings are created. So, that it is a condensed timeline. So it does kind of like muddle things. But I don't know. I'm really interested for season 2 and to see.
Me too.
To see, I'm really pro dwarf these days. Like I love the dwarves in the show. I loved learning more about them in the previous section. Yeah. So I'm really interested to see like if the show what they will show about the dwarven rings being created.
Well, and it's really interesting because that's the one sort of segment that we don't really know what happens, right? And you're talking about a lot about that in the last episode, but like even in Lord of the Rings, we know sort of what happens to the 9 and the 3, but the 7 are very like nebulous.
It's just like some of them were. I will share. Someone replied to a tweet and let me know that Durin's ring is canon.
Okay.
That they apparently either it was like background conversation in the movie or it was in the chapter, but it was apparently mentioned in passing in the Council of Elrond, I think is what they were quoting. Okay. But obviously like at the time that I was reading that or when I was watching it, I wouldn't have picked up on that and been like, what is that about? So maybe I'll have to go back and see. But apparently, yes, Durin's ring, this like 7th ring that escaped Sauron's possession for the longest time is real and is canon. So again, super exciting stuff for the show because we'll get to see that is something that like the lore fanatics can't say, well, that's not canon when the elven lords give King Durin III a ring, because that is exactly what Tolkien wrote. So super exciting. Okay, anyway. Yeah, that's the creation of the Rings of Power very briefly.
Oh, and if I can just point out sort of what we were talking about before, like this is, 1500, 1590. And then I think the show, in terms of where Numenor is like all the way in this 3175, 3255 sort of segment. So it is like thousands of years later, but obviously it's a huge amount of time that you cannot show in the span of a television series. So
what I thought they were going to reveal at some point in the throughout watching the first season and in between each episode speculating stuff, I thought there was going to be some kind of a time jump where because for a while we hadn't there were all these different groups of characters, and for a while they hadn't interacted yet. And so I was like, oh, they're going to reveal I thought that Numenor, the Numenor plotline was, you know, maybe in the year 3000. And I was like, oh, they're going to come over to Middle Earth. And then that's when they're going to reveal that the Southlanders are actually from like earlier on in the timeline or something. So I thought we had a couple different timelines going too. Like that could have been cool. Anyway, okay.
There's a lot of different ways they could have done it, right? But I think it does make sense. Like there are already so many characters, and I imagine they want you to feel invested and like get to know the characters. So the longer you can spend with them, the better. So I think it makes sense what they're doing, but
or the more painful, because
that's
like
true.
I really like Elendil.
I know.
He's a cool guy, and it's like, oh no.
Well, and also like Celebrimbor, to know like his fate. It's, you know, and I love, you know, how he's being portrayed as well. His character is great, and yeah, it's sad when you know what's going to happen to them, but
yes, yeah.
What can you do?
In the Third Age, it refers to it as the fading years of the Eldar. And even though there are like these periods of peace, because they just defeated Sauron, and in their eyes, they're probably at first, everyone's probably like, all right, we won. We can finally live at peace. All the badness is gone. But then as, you know, the years go on, and then it's like, oh no, there's Nazgul and there's a Witch King yeah, it always says like whisperings. Yeah. So there are these periods of peace, but it is kind of like the shadow is hanging over them. You know, it's the calm before the storm. It mentions, like we dove into last week, the dwarves and how they became a wandering people. That just like breaks my heart. The lifetime of the Númenóreans begins to decrease as they, you know, get further and further away from the people that they were in Númenor. And this is when, again, like another timeline compression in the show, this is where we have the wizards appear in Middle
Third
Earth.
Age. Yeah.
Yeah.
1,000 years into the Third Age.
Yes, yeah. So it's, let's see. So the creation of the One Ring is the year 1600, or let's say, okay, if we're going with the show, the Three Rings, 1590 in the Second Age. And then the Third Age ends in the year 3441.
The Second Age ends, 3441.
Or Second Age, yes, thank you. Yeah. So another 3,000 years after the Three Rings is when the wizards show up, whereas in the show, at least one wizard that we know of has arrived just before the creation of the Three Rings. So there's another timeline compression, but it says that they were messengers sent to contest the power of Sauron and to unite all those who had the will to resist him. But they were forbidden to match his power with power, or to seek to dominate elves or men by force and fear. So they're here to help out, but they know that they are not, you know, the chosen one, so to speak. They're like, we're here to help and to get everyone together to defeat Sauron, but we cannot defeat Sauron ourselves. We had some theorizing and discussion after the end of season 1, where one of my guests shared that she thought that the meteor should have crashed to Earth at the end of the season 1 finale, so that's the little cliffhanger.
That would have been cool.
In the lore, the wizards are sent to contest. You know, Sauron is growing in power.
Yes, that would have been good timing. And that's when the wizards show up. I see. Yeah.
And again, I won't go into it too much because I've already griped about it enough, but I don't think that the whole, like, ooh, who is Sauron thing should have been a main plot point. And so I think having the wizard, the stranger, appear at the end of season 1 when Sauron has revealed himself, he's returned to Mordor. I think that would have been a really smart move. But alas, that's not what we got, so we'll just have to see what happens.
Yeah, we'll see what they do with it.
It mentions that there are... Does it even say anything about the the blue wizards here?
I don't think so.
Like
no,
sometimes it
here.
says like and two blue. It just talks about Sauron and
Saruman.
Oh my god.
No problem.
Saruman and Gandalf.
Yeah.
It doesn't even mention Radagast here, so that's the third wizard.
I guess
and
these
then
were the two highest. Yeah.
Yeah, these are like the ones that we most know about. Someone on Twitter said last night that they wish there was a kind of like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, but for the two blue wizards that we never hear anything about. For those that don't know, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are these like two side characters in the Shakespeare play Hamlet. And they're Hamlet's friends, and they're called on by the king to like distract or cheer up Hamlet because he's super depressed. And so they show up, and then like they eventually go on like their own adventure and get like kidnapped by pirates, and eventually I think they're killed. But this play was later written, and it's called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, and it's the events of Hamlet but from the perspective of these two characters who only show up for like two scenes. So I would love to read something or watch something that's like the events of Middle Earth but from the perspective of these two wizards that we never know anything about.
Well, I don't know if you already discussed this a lot at the end of the series, but I'm still holding out that the stranger could be a blue wizard, because I think that would be cool. So
see, I think we will see the blue wizards. My theory right now is that, like, I know the show is leading us to believe that it's Gandalf because
well, they've used a lot of obvious signals, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But if you go back to the lore, it's Saruman who appears first. So I'm wondering if maybe this is actually Saruman.
Oh, that's interesting.
And like the reason that, he says the thing about like, when in doubt, follow your nose. Maybe that's something that he tells Gandalf and then Gandalf picks it up from him. Exactly. So I think the more likely reason is that it's just Gandalf and we're, overthinking.
Too. Yeah. But I feel a little bit like you were saying in your last episode about your, what they could do with the dwarves. And I'm like, I think it could be really compelling if it is Blue Wizard, because we don't know like anything about the Blue Wizards, and like there's so much they could do with that.
That's really exciting stuff.
Yeah. And I thought the mention of Rune really made me think like, oh, this could be Blue Wizard kind of hinting, but I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what they do.
I'm hoping that we do see more about the Blue Wizards, because we know literally nothing. It's so funny to me because Tolkien, he left no stone unturned.
He's
when
crazily
he was creating.
Specific about a lot of things.
About almost everything. Yeah. And then the Blue Wizards, nothing.
Maybe there's some like lost book about Blue Wizards that we just haven't found yet.
I know, yeah. I know that the Twitter, the Twitter account that I have for the podcast, I know that some like really smart, not that we aren't also smart people, but some like really like Tolkien intelligent people follow it. So maybe I'll tweet something and be like, is there anything about the Blue Wizards? Like, are there any like Tolkien like letters that he wrote where he mentioned something in passing, or like a draft, or is there something, because that's just so, it's just the, the only other thing I can think of is Tom Bombadil, where he just kind of left him, he just kind of like, super open-ended.
I was just actually reading this yesterday in one of his letters, and it just made me think of it, because you were saying, like, he is very specific about some things, but in one of his letters he said, I feel it's better not to state everything, and indeed it is more realistic, since in chronicles and accounts of real history, many facts that some inquirer would like to know are omitted, and the truth has to be discovered or guessed from such evidence as there is. So I feel like he does leave like some things maybe purposefully, like I think Tom Bombadil, he leaves purposefully vague, so that it's like, maybe he has an idea in his mind of who he actually is, but he like sort of leaves it for you to ponder and just come to your own conclusion.
I think that's so, that quote from, you said it was a letter.
Yeah.
That's so funny to me, because like he knows that it's almost more realistic or interesting to not write but he still like really detailed everything. Yeah, it was kind of like he had this idea, but he just he knew that in the back of his mind, but he just couldn't help himself from writing every last detail. So by the end of Lord of the Rings, we know that the 3 elven rings are in the possession of Galadriel, Elrond, and then like plot twist Gandalf. It's like, what?
Woo!
How did Gandalf get an elven ring? That's so interesting.
It is really interesting, right?
Yeah. So originally it starts out with Gil-galad, Galadriel, and Círdan. Mm-hmm. Gil-galad later, I believe,
He gives it to Elrond.
Oh, that's right. He gives it to Elrond.
Yeah.
Círdan is the shipwright at the coast, the Grey Havens. Mm-hmm. He's, reminder, like one of the OG elves. He's been there since like the beginning of time almost, in the scale of Middle Earth. And when Gandalf arrives, when he like first interacts with Gandalf, it says that he welcomed Mithrandir at the Grey Havens, knowing whence he came and whither he would return. Mm-hmm. Take this ring, master, for your labors will be heavy, but it will support you in the weariness that you have taken upon yourself. For this is the ring of fire, and with it you may, I think this is so interesting, with it you may rekindle hearts in a world that grows chill. Mm-hmm. And then he says, like, as for me, my heart is with the sea. So he's kind of now accepted, like, I don't want the responsibility of this ring, and also like its usefulness might be wasted on me because I'm just going to stay here. But I think that's so interesting that it says you may rekindle hearts in a world that grows chill, because that's really what Gandalf does time and time again.
It's so beautiful.
You know, his interaction with Bilbo to get Bilbo to go on this adventure. Even like just before that, how he meets Thorin in Bree and has this idea to reclaim Erebor. And like, it's kind of like, how did Gandalf convince so many people, you know, like how did he convince Frodo that, you know, he was responsible for the One Ring now, and like everything's going to be okay still. And how did he... Like, at some points, Sauron is growing and he has to convince the White Council that it's worth fighting. You know, like, there's so many instances where Gandalf has to encourage someone and convince someone to, like, take the next step and do something. Yeah. And maybe that's just, like, who he is as a person, or maybe it's the ring, you know?
Yeah. Or maybe it's, like, part of all of it, right? Like, his role as an Istari and, you know, who he is, and then also with the help of the ring.
Yeah.
And I think also, I think it's so interesting that Gandalf gets an elven ring when he's not an elf. But obviously it feels like it's like perfect for him. And I just thought, just like what you were saying in that quote about what Círdan's saying, where he says, "But as for me, my heart is with the sea, and I will dwell by the gray shores until the last ship sails. I will await you." And then I like went back to Return of the King at the end when like they're arriving at the Grey Havens, and it says, "As they came to the gate, Círdan the shipwright came forth to greet them. Very tall he was, and his beard was long, and he was gray and old, save that his eyes were keen as stars, and he looked at them and bowed and said, 'All is now ready.'" And I was like, oh my gosh, he said thousands of years before, "I will wait for you by the sea," and then here he is. And I was like, Tolkien, yeah, because it does say
for Círdan saw further and deeper than any other in Middle Earth. So some of that is, you know, that like elven foresight that he has. Yeah. But yeah, so incredible, like bringing it full circle for, you know, Círdan and Gandalf's journey together. Yeah.
I love it. So
that's just, you know, an explanation I thought was interesting for why Gandalf gets the elven ring, when it's like, well, hang on, when the wizards first came to Middle Earth, Saruman was the highest of them, Saruman the White. And it's like, why, you know, they didn't know until like well into the Third Age that Saruman was up to no good. At the time that the wizards first arrived, you would have no reason to believe that like Saruman can't be trusted with an elven ring. Yeah. And like this is how Gandalf ended up with this. Círdan was like, you know what? I just get a good vibe from you, and I think this is
actually best for you.
Yes, yeah. So then we go into the timeline of the Third Age. A lot of it is, events, like I said, most of it, I would say, is events that we just covered, or even just like it gets into like the events of The Hobbit and the events of Lord of the Rings. So it's like, if you want a more boring version of those stories, you can read this.
Or go read the book.
Go read the book. But like, we already know most of this. So I'll just point out a few things that I thought were interesting. The first mention of halflings, so to speak, is not until the year 1050 in the Third Age. It says the Perinath are first mentioned in records with the coming of the Harfoots to Eriador. So even though, like, theoretically the halflings have been around this whole time, it's not until the Third Age that they become kind of like known to other people. And I think that's so interesting. Because those are the people that like Tolkien started this world with.
Yeah.
Going all the way back to The Hobbit. Like when he that was the first thing he wrote, and the first people he wrote were hobbits, and then they're the last people to be introduced to the world.
Although I'm not sure what idea came to him first, like, because I feel like he was working on the Silmarillion, like from super early on in his writings as well. So I don't know.
Yeah, it is kind of like, I'm sure he was building so much of this world in his head and in scrap notes and stuff. And it was all there anyway. It was just a matter of, organizing it.
Yeah, but I do think, like you're saying, like, he has made the key characters of, like, the fully fleshed out stories, like, about hobbits. And, like, those are, like, the characters that, like, we can relate to. And, yeah, so I feel like hobbits had a special place in his heart. So it is just interesting.
And yet, like, they're the least written about almost, like. Something I thought was funny is that in this huge timeline, there are a couple things where it's like, that seems like a random thing to throw in. For example, he makes sure that we know that pipeweed was planted in the year 2670.
To know the history of pipeweed.
Yes. Let me see. What does it say? Yeah, it says, Tobold plants pipeweed in the South Farthing.
They even know the person who planted it.
Yes. And it's like, this is what, like reading this timeline, it's like, I can see Tolkien being like, okay, what are the, like, obviously so much happens in this world, but what are the main events that like really are important for establishing like how the things that happen afterwards came to be, and like, setting up these dominoes, so to speak. And he's like, one of those dominoes has to be pipeweed.
Yeah.
And making sure we know.
I feel like the timelines really pull out, the important markers of history for like elves and men, and I feel like maybe for hobbits, that's the important marker of history.
That is true, yeah. Because it also says, here we go. In the year 2790 is the birth of Gerontius, later known as the Old Took.
Ah.
Yeah, it's like, who is that guy? It's the Old Took. So he was born in the year 2790. Yeah, you're right. And then he died in the year 2920. So yeah, pulling out those important markers for kind of each of the races. Something that I never thought about, and I was like, oh wait, yeah, that makes sense. This is just kind of me connecting dots that like I previously forgot to connect.
Yeah.
When Gandalf visits Bilbo at the Hobbit, and when they set off on this journey, Gandalf has the key to Erebor. And he just kind of in passing is like, oh yeah, your dad gave it to me.
Yeah.
But the timeline points out that it says in 2850, Gandalf enters Dol Guldur, and that is where he finds that Thrain, Thorin's father, has been captured. And he, at that time, is when he receives the key to Erebor, and then he leaves and Thrain dies in Dol Guldur. And then afterwards is when that's kind of one of the things that's making Gandalf really adamant to the White Council about like, we need to fight Sauron. Like, I just found King Thrain, he died, and he was you know, being tortured and captured by Sauron's forces. Like, this is a huge thing, but it's not it's not for several years after that they finally go to confront Sauron in Dol Guldur.
Yeah, and I feel like in 2770, Smaug the dragon takes over Erebor. So I feel like the timeline has all these things that are sort of like setting up The Hobbit and like setting up Lord of the Rings. And you can sort of see Tolkien like going back and being like, okay, for The Hobbit, like these events are taking place. So like when would Smaug have taken over Erebor? Or like when would Gandalf have gotten the key? And all of these things setting up, you know, the Hobbit story.
Yes, totally. And then in 2941, it says Thorin Oakenshield and Gandalf visit Bilbo in the Shire. And then it says Bilbo meets Smeagol Gollum and finds the ring. And it's just so funny to see like one of the most famous, you know, stories in history condensed to like Thorin and Gandalf visit Bilbo in the Shire.
I know. It's crazy,
it's like, well,
right?
There's a little more to that.
Yeah, there's like, for The Hobbit especially, like the book itself is condensed to like 2 like points on the timeline. You know, it's like very short. But then when you get to The Lord of the Rings, it's like he expands on it by like day.
Everything.
Yeah, like every day, let me give you the whole thing. But for The Hobbit, it's like very small.
It's
like, just go read the book.
Yes. The way I was also kind of viewing this timeline is like, how does it, you know, we were saying, oh, well, what are the important markers in history for each of the races?
Yeah.
I was also looking at it as like, what are the important moments in time for the One Ring? And like, this is a huge, because it also says, it points out when like 500 years prior to that, it says that about this time, Deagle, the store, finds the One Ring and is murdered by Smeagol.
Yeah.
And then it says after that, about this time, Smeagol hides in the Misty Mountains. So setting up like, where is the One Ring?
Yeah. And isn't it, it's like 2,463 years into the Third Age that like the One Ring is found. So it's like, I feel like I didn't really quite fathom like how much of the Third Age, let alone the other 2 ages, had happened before, you know,
so true,
it even like setting into motion the events of Lord of the Rings. Like there's thousands of years before it's even found that are happening that Tolkien planned out.
I felt like reading this puts everything, especially when you get into like the really detailed account of Lord of the Rings, it really puts everything into a huge, like on a like grander scheme of things.
Yeah, for sure.
Because you're reading it and you're like, oh, dang, like Gandalf was fighting, you know, from the time that Gandalf confronts the Balrog to the, like, it says, okay, so I guess, let's fast forward to all of that then. So in the timeline of Lord of the Rings, like, for example, what I'm talking about with this, like, grand scheme of things, January 15th is when, to the Fellowship, they're like, oh, Gandalf dies on January 15th. Because that's when, but not really. Yeah, it just says the Bridge of Khazad-dûm and Fall of Gandalf. And so the rest of the Fellowship leave Moria. But on January 23rd, it says Gandalf pursues the Balrog. And then the 25th, he casts down the Balrog and passes away. So he is fighting the Balrog for 10 days.
10 days. 10 days fighting a Balrog. Wow.
Totally wild. Totally. So it really puts it into a huge, like, that perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, I think just jumping off of that, like going back a bit, like, I feel like, especially because I watch the movies a lot, like, you sort of don't get a sense of the time that's passing.
Exactly.
But, like, you know, in the beginning of Fellowship, there's, like, 17 years between when when Bilbo leaves and Gandalf is like, oh, maybe this is the One Ring. And then, you know, Frodo sets on his journey 17 years later. And in the movie, it's like, you know, it seems like weeks have passed or something. But actually, like, years have passed. Like, and then the timeline shows, like, during that time, Gandalf and Aragorn were, like, up to a lot of stuff. They were, like, out there trying to track down Gollum, and, like, other things were happening. And, you know, so like you're saying, it really gives you perspective on the actual time frame of everything.
Yes. Oh, just a, like, really random fun fact that I found interesting, whatever, is that Faramir and Sam are the same age.
Yes.
They were born in the same year.
Yeah.
Did not know that.
Yeah,
so I just thought that was
the ages of characters is so interesting. I'm super nerdy, and I had so much fun preparing for this. And I like wrote down the names and ages of all of the Fellowship and like some other key characters based on this timeline. And it's so interesting, like, if you don't mind, I'll just like list them really fast.
Yes.
But like, so this is the ages of the Fellowship at the time the Fellowship of the Ring was formed. So Frodo was 50, Sam was 38, Pippin was 28, Merry was 36, Aragorn was 87, Boromir was 40, Legolas was thousands of years old, maybe like, you know.
He doesn't count.
Very old.
Yeah.
Gimli was 139.
That's not mentioned in the timeline is like when Gimli and when Legolas are born.
Yeah.
I would be, you know,
interested. Yeah,
I'm sure you can look it up. You know?
Yeah. And then like Bilbo's 128, so Bilbo's older than Aragorn. Bilbo was born before Aragorn. Eomer's 27, Eowyn's 23, Faramir's 35. So like, I just feel like even that really helped me remember or get better perspective on the kind of, the characters and how they act and the sort of choices they make. Because I think in the movies, I think the actors are all perfectly cast and like I love all of them. But like Frodo, Elijah Wood is 18 and like Billy Boyd is 33. Elijah Wood was
he
was like
child.
A baby, you know? And like, but like in the books, Frodo's the oldest out of all of them. You know, and Sam's pretty young and Pippin's a baby. He's like not even a tween yet, you know? And like, so I just feel like it really helped me get a better perspective of like who these characters are and like how they act in the books and, you know, all of that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, totally. Again, kind of going back to like, oh, why did Tolkien, like, what are the points that he decided were important information to include in this timeline? He makes sure to note everything about Gandalf meeting Shadowfax.
Oh, yeah.
Which is so funny to me. So Gandalf, after he escapes from Orthanc, when he has been captured by Saruman, he escapes Orthanc. It says he arrives to Edoras as a beggar and is refused admittance. The next day, he gains entrance to Edoras. So I don't know what that was about. If he was like trying to disguise himself and be like, no, I'm not Gandalf. I'm just an old man. And then when that didn't work, he's like, just kidding. I'm Gandalf the Grey. I need to see the king immediately. Theoden says, yeah, sure, take any horse you want. The following day, Gandalf meets Shadowfax, and then he has to, like, track him because Shadowfax won't let him ride him.
Yeah.
The following day, it says Gandalf overtakes Shadowfax, and then the day after that is when Gandalf finally leaves Rohan with Shadowfax. So 4 days have passed just because he's like 2 of those days, 3 of those days were just taming Shadowfax. But like Frodo, meanwhile, is like sitting in the Shire being like, what am I supposed to do? I'm so confused. Yeah. Gandalf was supposed to come and meet me, but he's not here anymore.
Where is he at?
And meanwhile, Gandalf is just over f***ing around in Edoras trying to get a cool horse for 4 days. But I just thought that was so also quintessentially Tolkien that he was like, I want to make sure the details about Shadowfax are in this timeline.
Yeah. I want you to know exactly what Gandalf was up to.
Yes.
But it is, like between September 23rd and October 25th, Frodo and Gandalf are like kind of constantly missing each other. Like,
yeah, I
Frodo
didn't realize that he was so close to them.
Frodo leaves Bree, and then the next day, Gandalf arrives at Bree, and it's like, oh, you just missed him. And then
missed it.
And then I feel like it happens again when the Fellowship is in Lorien for like a month, and then literally it says that Gandalf was that I think it's Gwahir, the eagle.
Gwahir, yeah.
Yeah, bears Gandalf to Lorien literally the next day. So it's like he just missed them. And it's like, wow, I didn't really realize he was like, they were like constantly just missing each other.
This is when the timeline, this part is really cool to read, because when you're reading the story, obviously you can only follow, 1 or 2 characters at a time. But this puts it, like we've been saying a million times, puts it into perspective of like, what are the other characters doing at this time? What's going on?
Yeah.
Just a sad fact that made me, I don't know, more sad.
Yeah.
Is, and maybe there's a good chance that like I read this in the book and I even talked about it, but I clearly forgot and then so this might not even be new information, but it feels new to me. It says that when Boromir dies, his horn is heard in Minas Tirith.
Yeah, I highlighted that too.
That makes me so sad because, for your reference, Faramir is my favorite character ever. He can do no wrong, except for in the movie. But that's a different story. That's a different story.
That's a different story completely.
The fact that the Horn of Gondor can be heard in Minas Tirith says to me that Faramir knows his brother's in trouble.
Yeah.
Something is happening.
Yeah.
He needs help, and he can't help him.
He can't get there. It is heartbreaking. It really is.
Kills me.
But that's so horn, huh? To be heard in Minas Tirith. I don't know how many miles.
Maybe it has maybe it has just like magic Gondor powers, and like it's not the distance or the loudness of the horn. Maybe it's just like this is a magical horn that can be heard by fellow Gondorians,
it's a horn of Gondor,
or something.
So it's always heard in Gondor. Maybe
heard in Gondor. Maybe I don't know about the mechanics. Yeah, especially because like in the movie, it's like antler or something. It's like a wooden curved thing. I don't know. I mean, a horn. Yeah. But like, it's not like a trumpet or something.
Yeah.
I think that's really the only thing I was going to point out in like the Lord of the Rings timeline. Was there anything that you wanted to talk about before we get into like immediately after the ring is destroyed? If there's anything you wanted to talk about.
This is going back to the very beginning of the timeline, and maybe it's just I just picked up on it because Elrond's like one of my favorite characters in Rings of Power, and just in general. But like at the beginning of the Third Age, he weds Celebrian, daughter of Celeborn, and actually like I feel like we get a little bit more about Celeborn in this appendix than like we ever get anywhere else, which is interesting. So I'm just it just made me think about what they'll do with the show, with all of that. And then it just made me sad.
Especially because the show is painting Galadriel and Elrond as good friends, and then, like, he's gonna marry her daughter?
Yeah.
That, like, it's also in the timeline of the show, she hasn't... spoiler alert for Rings of Power.
She's married.
I say that, like, an hour into this. She, at this point, thinks that Celeborn is dead. In the show by the end of season 1 because there was some battle and he never came back. So at this point, it's not even like, oh, they're married and, she has a kid, but Celeborn's just being a stay-at-home dad. Yeah. It's just they haven't even gotten married at this point in the show. So that will be really weird.
Yeah, it's all of a sudden to think how they'll work that out. I don't know. And then also, I think it points out, when Celebrian receives a poisoned wound and, like, Elrond can't heal her and she departs over the sea. And, like, I don't know, all of that. I feel like that just helps give a lot of better perspective on Elrond and, like, his story and, like, his background. And so, like, because you're doing the tale of Aragorn and Arwen and sort of, I think some of maybe his reluctance...
I realized as I was editing that episode, I was like, oh, shoot, I skipped over, because it does mention, I think, that point that, Arwen's mother at some point gets injured, and then she goes over to the Undying Lands. And I think I, like, skipped over that point in the conversation. Yeah. And I think it does provide more insight to why Elrond is so...
sad,
reluctant, and for Arwen to stay with Aragorn, because in his mind he's like, okay, it's fine, one day I'll go over, we'll all go over to the Undying Lands and we'll be a family again, we'll be reunited. I want my daughter to be reunited with her mother. And so when Arwen wants to stay behind, he's like, that means you're never going to see your mother again. Yeah.
And I feel especially for elves, it's like they're not as used to that, right? And so, it's just really, it breaks my heart. And actually, I don't know, it just made me think, I was listening to this episode of The Friendship Onion. I don't know if you've ever listened to it. It's a podcast with the actors of Merry and Pippin, so Billy Boyd and Dominic Monaghan, and they were interviewing Bear McCreary, who is the composer for the music of Rings of Power, and he was just talking about how he really struggled to write the theme for Elrond's character, and then he went back and like read the books and the appendices and, like, got this greater, or, like, just reminded him of this context of Elrond and, like, the sort of tragedy that, because he also lost his father and his mother, you know? So it's like, he's lost a lot. And then, you know, and then he will lose more. And and then he was able to write this beautiful theme that is kind of, like, tinged with, like, sadness, because Bear McCreary was trying to bring that into the music. And I feel like it gives you a whole nother layer to Elrond's character and, like, how he acts and the choices he makes and the things he says in the books and movies as well.
Yeah, I would say if there's any non-main character of Lord of the Rings that you're interested in, go to the appendices and learn. There's probably more about them there, you know, and, like, more finer details that really fill out that character that in the book maybe only get, like, a passing mention or something. Like Arwen, for example, is barely in Lord of the Rings.
You can get a whole tale about her.
Exactly. We heard about this in Durin's Folk, that there was also, during the War of the Ring, there was also, you know, battles going on by Erebor and Dale. And so we get more of an explanation for, if you were ever watching the movies or reading the book and you're like, where are the rest of the elves?
Exactly.
Where are the dwarves? Like, why are they not showing up to help?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is where we get explanation for why they're not with our characters. They're not at Minas Tirith. They're not at the Black Gate, but they are still fighting on their own fronts. 3 times Lorien had been assailed from Dol Guldur, but the elves are able to push them back and retake, you know, their land, their forests, and they win. It also says that the realm of Thranduil was invaded, so that's Mirkwood, and again, they're able to take back their forests and win. And afterwards, Mirkwood is later renamed to the Wood of Green Leaves. That's, like, thriving and great, but it does say that Lorien was just kind of sad and depressing to go to because so many elves had left by that point. So even though there's these battles against the elves kind of in the forests and the woods, they're able to win and take back all their stuff. The same can't really be said for the poor dwarves, man. They just cannot cut a break.
Yeah.
Oh my God. So there are battles on the front by Erebor, like I said, Erebor, and then that town of Dale. King Brand is Bard's grandson. So Bard is the person who killed Smaug.
In The Hobbit.
In The Hobbit. And then this is his grandson who is now the leader, King Brand. And then Dane Ironfoot is still the leader of Durin's Folk. This is the same dwarf who, in the battle to try and retake Moria before the events of The Hobbit, he killed Azog, and then after after Battle of Five Armies, when Thorin and Keely and Fili die, the leadership goes over to him next. So this is still that same dwarf, and it's like he's seen some action, you know. Okay, yeah, so it says that King Brand had the aid of the dwarves of Erebor, and there was a great battle at the mountain's feet. It lasted 3 days, but in the end, both King Brand and King Dane Ironfoot were slain, and the Easterlings had the victory.
Boo.
Sad. So everyone takes refuge in Erebor, and they're just kind of being sieged and just trying to hold out as long as they can, and luckily, when the ring is destroyed, that calls back, and like all of Sauron's forces, all of the darkness, they flee and go elsewhere at the destruction of the ring. And so they're able to come out of it and then continue on. That's what was going on with the elves and the dwarves. If you were ever curious about what was happening, I still will point out, though, it's like those things only happened at the very tail end. So like maybe we could have used some more assistance
at the front,
but
at the beginning.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess they should, you know, there were elves and dwarves represented at the Council of Elrond, so
and in the Fellowship.
I guess they were there. Yeah.
And I guess at the beginning it is sort of like, there's not like, you know, in the Fellowship of the Ring, there's not big battles going on, right? It's like a secret mission of stealth.
Yes, that's true. All right, and then we get into the like post Lord of the like Return of the King ends. The last line is Sam comes home and says like, well, I'm back. So what happens after that?
Mm-hmm. Cue the epilogue.
Yes, the epilogue. Exactly. It's titled Later Events Concerning the Members of the Fellowship of the Ring. Originally, Frodo becomes the mayor and then someone else becomes the mayor after him. And then after that, Sam is elected mayor. Woohoo. And he is elected mayor multiple times.
7 times.
The people know what they want, and what they want is Samwise Gamgee.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
And each term is, I think, 7 years. So, like, that's
a long time.
Time.
Yes. Yes. They're making these active choices to make sure he is their leader. Pippin has a son who he names Faramir. It kills me every time. Oh my god, it just touches my heart.
And isn't that, you know, that scene in the movie where Faramir and Pippin have their little like moment? And I'm just thinking like maybe that really stuck with him, and then he like names his son Faramir, and it's like it is kind of like it's strange and interesting because it's like, well, Pippin was the one who saved Faramir's life. Yeah. So technically Faramir should name his son Pippin. You're right. You're right.
So I have to wonder and think like they must have in like the time the time that they were hanging around Gondor for the coronation and Aragorn and Arwen's wedding and stuff, they must have had some extra bonding during that time, you know?
Yeah.
Similarly, so Merry becomes the Master of Buckland, and when this happens, it says that gifts are sent to him by King Éomer and Lady Éowyn.
So cute!
So similar to how Pippin bonded with Faramir and Gondor, Merry also had this bond with Éomer and Éowyn. Then further down, we learn that Sam's daughter, Goldilocks, marries Pippin's son, Faramir. So cute. And also, like, I have to imagine that it must just be so fun for, like, you to be best friends, you know, with your people, and then you grow up and you get married and you have kids, and then, like, your kids get married. That's so fun.
It's really sweet.
Then we're going to get sad now, guys.
Can we be happy a little longer?
Yes. Do you have a happy thing to bring up before the sad stuff?
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, because in 1442, like, Sam and his wife and his daughter go and live in Gondor for a year. So it's like they're going and living it up with Aragorn and Arwen, and like Aragorn's like gifting land to the Shire, and like I just feel it's really nice.
Oh, and Aragorn also passes a law that no men should enter the Shire, and I'm like, what? I mean, like, he is a king, literally, but, like, he's amazing. Yeah. Well, I think it mentions when they meet up later, they, like, meet at the edge. Yeah. I guess, of the land. Yeah. But, like, they also make Sam and Rosie's first daughter, Eleanor, the maid of honor to Queen Arwen.
It's so cute. And even a little bit before that, like, it was saying that Éowyn and Éomer depart for Rohan with the sons of Elrond. And I was like, oh, that's really nice. Like, that, you know, these people from Rohan and these people from Rivendell are kind of, like, coming together.
They're all coming together,
I feel like there's lots of, like, you know, people are, like, able to have relationships and friendships and, like, come together and visit each other. And it's a really nice picture.
It is a really nice picture. And the sad stuff is also nice, but it's still sad.
Bittersweet, yeah.
Yeah. So in 1482 is when Rosie dies. And Sam he departs Bag End on September 22nd. And this is, I think, also the same date that they originally left.
Yeah, it's Frodo and Bilbo's birthday.
And it's when they left the Shire for Frodo to go to the Grey Havens.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I guess he's like, I mean, I might as well stick with tradition.
Yeah.
He goes to see Eleanor, his daughter, and to whom he gives the Red Book. And afterwards, it is passed down through their family to keep track of, and I guess they are the ones that wrote this timeline, you know. He says goodbye to Eleanor. This is the last person who sees him, and he went to the Grey Havens and passed over sea, last of the ring bearers. So he goes to be, and this is where I'll plug this. Target, I'll have to leave a link in the episode description. Target low-key released gay Sam and Frodo merch.
What?
Because it's a t-shirt and it has a rainbow flag and it's like Sam and Frodo and it says something, I forget what it's like a quote around it, and everyone's like, Target has gay Sam and Frodo merch.
Wow.
What is this? What's happening? Apparently it's only offered online. But anyway, I always love to say when people are like, oh, everyone of course can believe what they want about Sam and Frodo's relationship, and I think viewing them as strictly platonic friends is equally as beautiful as viewing them as, you know, romantic partners. But one thing I always say is, would you leave this plane of existence to go be with your strictly platonic friend? Well, actually, I don't know, because later on, Legolas and Gimli do the same thing.
Yeah, they do, yeah. And I feel like
so I don't know,
leaves
maybe.
after his wife dies, and it's kind of, I don't know, like, yeah, it's hard to know, because obviously he lives a really full life, and also, like, he, you know, only held the ring for a very short amount of time, but I feel like Frodo going to the Undying Lands is because, like, he's just so damaged by, like, what has happened, like, the trials that he has faced are, like, too much for him, and, like, obviously, Sam didn't have that to the extent that Frodo did, but he still did. Like, he was right there with him the whole way, you know? So I think, like, for him to, you know, have this gift of going, like, living the last of his days in, you know, the peace and beauty of the Undying Lands is, like, really beautiful and, like, really well-deserved, you know? And, yeah. And I also, like, I know I've heard people say that they feel like The Lord of the Rings is almost the story of Sam, because he's the one who sort of, like, makes this huge evolution, and, like, and I feel like for him to sort of get that final resting place, like, kind of brings his story to, like, the ending it deserves. If you know what I mean.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely what he, you know, after all this time, after being mayor for
49
you know,
years, the man deserves rest.
Exactly. He deserves to retire in peace. So Sam, goes over to the Undying Lands. 2 years after that, Éomer sends message that he wants to see Merry. And so Merry's also like, well, I'll come, but also
old, but I can do it.
And he's like, okay, but I'm bringing my friend Pippin. Yeah. So Merry and Pippin go over to see King Éomer in Rohan, basically one last time. Also, at this time, Pippin is a Thane. Yes,
Pippin was made Took and Thane, which is like the military leader of the Shire.
Oh, so funny.
They've all got their positions of accolades leadership and authority. Yes. Very well deserved.
They go to visit, so they go to Edoras and they visit Éomer, and it says that the king died that year. And after that, Merry and Pippin go to Gondor and spent the rest of their time there. Until they died and were laid in Rathdennen among the great of Gondor. 60-ish years later is when Aragorn dies. And it is said that the beds of Meriadoc and Pippin were set beside the bed of the great king. So Merry and Pippin and Aragorn are all buried together. I think so it would have... It's really great. I think it would have been hilarious if, like, Aragorn had died first, and then it was Merry and Pippin who were like, no, we're important enough that we should be buried with the king. But it was the opposite. It was Aragorn who decided, I want to be laid to rest.
It's like the end of the movie where, like, the hobbits are bowing to Aragorn, and Aragorn's like, no, like, you bow to no one.
Give it to me.
It's like, he was that humble. Oh, so good.
Love it. Then at this point, Legolas built a gray ship in Ithilien and sailed down the Anduin and so oversea. And with him, it is said, went Gimli the dwarf. And when the ship passed, an end was come in Middle-earth of the Fellowship of the Ring. The end. Oh,
so beautiful.
What a good ending. It literally ends with Legolas and Gimli sailing off into the sunset.
Yeah, to the Undying Lands. I feel like it really goes full circle, right? Because basically he's just giving the final fates of like the full fellowship. So now we know how like they all end up. And like, you know, Gandalf, Frodo, Sam, Legolas, and Gimli are all in the Undying Lands together.
Yeah, they're all having a party over there.
You know, and then Aragorn, Pippin, and Merry are resting together. And then Boromir had died earlier, but, you know.
Yes.
So it's just really nice. Like they're, you know, like all kind of together again at the end in a way. So, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Definitely. They're all still together in spirit, at least. Yeah. All of them, yeah. So that is whatever the Appendix B was titled. That's what it was.
The Tale of Years?
Yes, I think that's what it was. So here is the game plan for the rest of the appendices, listeners. I'm skipping over, don't get mad at me. I'm skipping over Appendix C and D, because Appendix C is family trees, and no one needs to listen to me say,
this son was son of this person, son of this person.
Say Malva Headstrong married Gormadoc Deep Diver, and their son, they had a son named Sadok, which is interesting because that's the name of the
Hobbit.
head
Halfling.
in Rings of Power.
Yeah.
But maybe that's the only interesting part of the... Yeah, so no one needs to hear me say son of, daughter of, married, nephew of for an hour. And then the Appendix B is the Shire calendar. And then, I guess it just says, the calendars. Mm-hmm. So this is where I really just ignore dates because technically there's like the Shire Reckoning and like the Shire calendar is a different calendar than it's so confusing.
It is, yeah.
And I don't need to dive into that. You know, we just read a whole timeline. I don't need to understand the mechanics of how time works, of how the passage of days and months work. So we'll pick up next with Appendix E, which is writing and spelling. And this one, I even was like, I think I could skip this one, but
to get a linguist,
I'm going to try and find someone who is like a linguist and have them on for Appendix E and maybe even Appendix F, because Appendix F is about the languages. So I think this could be interesting. In theory, it might be a boring episode. I don't know. So we'll see. But I think Appendix E is where you learn how to like theoretically pronounce everything. So everything that I've been mispronouncing up until now.
You'll realize all the things.
Yes.
In hindsight.
So that's the game plan, listeners, if you were wondering. And then after that, I have some fun stuff theoretically planned. I need to find people to join me in the fun. Well, Bekah, thank you for joining me, for taking this dive into the timelines with me. This is initially when I said, no, I'm not going to read the appendices, or I'm not going to, I'm just going to read this little tidbit and then skip over the rest. It was because I was worried about how I would cover it in the podcast. Because reading a timeline doesn't sound very interesting when you say it like that. But I think we had a great time and a great discussion.
I had a great
time. Where can people find you on the internet?
Yeah, I still feel pretty new to the Tolkien social media scene, but I do have an Instagram and a blog at Tolkien Tidbits, and that's where people can, find me, connect with me, and I've started like a second breakfast book club where we're reading the Silmarillion. As I'm rereading it, I'm just sharing what I'm finding and learning, and hopefully it can just help make Tolkien a little more digestible and be fun to, like you were saying, like all these little tidbits that I'm picking up from reading the books and watching the movies and the show and everything, just sharing all of that. And if anyone happens to be interested in the recipes behind my second breakfast and any more healthy lifestyle content, then I also share a lot on my Instagram at Bites by Bekah and my blog bitesbybekah.com. It's Bites by Bekah. So yeah, I'd love to connect with more Tolkien people and lovers. So yeah.
Yeah, there are some really cool Tolkien creators I've come across. Sometimes there's not so fun people out there in this space, but I find that a lot of the creators are really who seem to be such genuine people, and it's so fun to connect with everyone.
Yeah, and we have like amazing material to like explore and dive into, like Tolkien did. You know, like, I mean, just as we see in the timeline, like he took so much care and like, you know, planned out everything and like shared it all, and like the amount of stuff we have to explore is basically endless. So it's exciting.
Yes. That's What I'm Talking About is a proud member of WBNE. If you want to learn more about the network, you can go to wbne.org. The cover is by Vaishon Brandon. You can support him on Instagram at Vaishon Designs. You can get merch for That's What I'm Talking About by going to tpublic.com/talkingaboutpod. You can follow the podcast on social media at TolkienAboutPod, and you can follow me on Twitter and TikTok at MCWhatsup and on Instagram at MCTurndownForWhat. If you want to support the podcast, you can become a patron. Go to patreon.com/TolkienAboutPod to explore the different levels of support that are available. The newsletter is available to all patrons, even if you just join the basic $1 tier, and the February newsletter should be posted already. And I've decided that moving forward, I will include a section that gives a shout out to the things that friends of the pod are working on. So for example, this month, Black Nerds Create by Anna and Delia. You know them. They've been on multiple times. We usually end up screaming about Fëanor or Halbrand. Always a blast with them. Anyway, throughout the month of February, Black Nerds Create is hosting Black Magical History Month.
At Black Nerds Create, we love all things fandom and creation, and we especially love fantasy. That's why we're excited for our newly named Black Magical History Month coming in February. Black Magical History Month is our 6th annual celebration of Black stories, characters, and fans across different fantasy media. Get ready for a month of digital events, challenges, and community turn-ups all across social media. To stay up to date and get more information, go to blacknerdscreate.com.
Also, of course, gotta give a shout out to this week's episode sponsor, Taylor. Taylor, you wonderful human being. Thank you so much for your continued support of the podcast. It means so much to me. Do you have any parting words for the audience?
You know, especially if you feel daunted by something like the Appendices or the Silmarillion, I would really encourage people to give it a chance and sort of like take from it what you want or what you need. Like if you really love the dwarves, then, you know, go read about Durin's folk, or if you're obsessed with Aragorn and Arwen like I am, then you can read The Tale of Aragorn and Arwen and like, you know, sort of explore what you can and let it just enrichen your experience of Tolkien and like all of the sort of offshoots that we're constantly getting more of, you know, and yeah, just like enjoy the experience and let it make it all the more richer.
And that's what I'm talking about.